Okay, today's lesson is how to create a bar chart or a bar graph using Minitab. I have in front of you opened the restaurant data set, and it's in the Minitab sample library. If you wanted to follow along with me, you could go to File, Open Worksheet, look in this Minitab sample data library, and open up REST RNT, and it would be the same data set that I currently have open. Okay. I want to do a bar chart is only for categorical data, so I want to do a bar chart for ownership type. Okay, so that's the variable of interest for me. And so the easiest way to start is to up a graph. We're going to do a bar chart, and we are doing a simple one. There are two choices here for what the bars represent. We want counts of unique values, which is what we're going to always use as long as we have the raw data. I will show you in a little bit later values from a table, but right now we want counts of unique values. And we're going to do simple. So we start with OK. We choose the variable of interest to us, which is ownership. And there are lots of buttons that we can go through. I am going to start us out simply and show you how to change some of the options, and then come back and show you these buttons again to see where you can make selections proactively. Okay, so I'm going to say go ahead and say OK. Minitab gives you a nice chart. Of course, this wouldn't be a publication quality chart because, first of all, there are 1, 2, 3s and stars, which I don't know what they mean. Owner's not really well labeled, and the title's not well labeled. Count seems to be okay. So there are a few things we have to clean up. It's the category labels, the category axis, and the titles certainly have to be cleaned up before is presentation style. The easiest way to do that is to certainly just click and point here. So if I double click on this, I can actually change this, and I could say this is the ownership type for n equal 279 restaurants in Wisconsin in 1979. A little bit more of a informative title. And so down here, once again, I'm just going to make it ownership type. Make it a little bit better. To change the category labels, you can double click the category label. You can go to the Labels tab, and you notice that it says automatic, so it's going by what's already in the data set. In order to change it, we're going to do just specified. So I am going to tell you what each of these are. So the first type of ownership is, I'm thinking for a second, is sole ownership. So I am actually just going to put sole ownership with a hyphen there. Then I'm going to space, and I'm going to know that the second one is a partnership, and the third is corporate. And the missing, that asterisk, stands for missing information. Or maybe I'll just make it not available. Okay. I'm going to tell you that in this box, a space indicates a new category. And so sole ownership works because I used a hyphen. But if I wanted to put a space in there, then it would think the first category 1 is sole, the second one is ownership, the third one is partnership, and the asterisk stood for corporate. If you want a space in your label, just put it in quotes. Now partnership, since it doesn't have any spaces, I could or could not put it in quotes. So for example, I'll put corporate in quotes to show you it doesn't really matter. And then finally, not available does have to be in quotes. So I'm going to put that around that and say OK. So the key is to make sure it's in the order specified. If there had been no 2s in the data set, you would have wanted to skip partnership. So this is where you really need to know what the data mean. Okay? And so I'll say OK. And you see that it changes just fine. Now this data set is, this graph, if I want it in count data, is fine. You can do a right mouse click and send this graph to Microsoft Word, and it'll be right there for you. Okay. But before we just stop with that, let's talk about a few other things we can do. Sometimes we'd rather not have this axis be in count, but we would rather have it in percentage. In order to do that, you could right mouse click on the axis, and you can go to Graph Options, and you can say Show Y as a percent. Okay, so that's right mouse click. I'll go back and turn it to counts. Right mouse click, Graph Options, and if I want it back in count, I can turn it off and go back and forth. Okay, so there are two options here. You can either put it in frequency, which is what it defaults to, or come in here under Graph Options, Chart Options, and change it to percentages. Okay. Either one of those work as graphs for this. All right, now let's talk about a few other things. You can pretty this thing up. You can do lots of other options on this. If you right mouse click, you see that you have lots of different things that you can do. I'm not worried about that. I really wanted to just give you the basics. But one thing I do want to talk about is this not available. When I show a graph in percents, it's going to calculate the percent as being the sample size for that category, or the frequency for that category, divided by the total sample size, which is 279. There are times that we want the not available or the missing data to be one of those percentages, but there are lots of other times where we do not want the missing data to show up. And so for that we have to decide that before we do the graph. And so I'm going to come back up and talk about doing this graph eliminating the missing data. And so once again, we're going to go to Graph, we're going to go to Bar Chart, we're going to Simple. Notice that it remembers everything we did the last time, but now I want to play with the buttons. And the one button that's important to do before you create the graph is the Data Options button. The Data Options button lets you decide what data to include or exclude. And so we're going to go with the group options here about missing data. Minitab assumes missing data should be a valid group. If you want to exclude it and exclude it from the percentage calculations, you would deselect those two buttons. So this has to be something that you do before you do the graphs. That's what's going to get rid of the missing data. Okay. Now, it's not going to remember any of the other settings, but notice that we've got these buttons, these other buttons here. We can play with them as well right now if we'd rather do it now than later. Chart Options is where I can set the percentage if I want to see it in percent mode. So I could start right there and set it in percent mode. But I always have the option of changing it after the fact. We can play with scaling if you want. The one point on this that I think you can play with if you'd like is whether you want to transpose the value in category scales. This changes the graph from having the bars go up and down to have the bars go vertical. For bar charts it doesn't really matter, so if you wanted that you could change that. That's the one option I think under bar chart scale. And once again, I'm going to show you that you could have done it after the fact. So I'll say OK here. Labels, you can put in all your titles, subtitles, footnotes. You can go to the data label button if you want to put some data labels on it. I typically don't worry about the data labels. I only worry about titles and footnotes. Once again, you already saw that we could do that after the fact, so I don't usually worry about them here. Data view tells us how you want them set up. Quite honestly, there's nothing really to play with here, so I never play with this section. Multiple graphs we'll use later, and of course data options we've already talked about. Okay, so if we're all set, we can say OK, and see that first of all we got the vertical graph. It's in percent because I told it to, but it doesn't remember any of these things that we have to do. It did only create the 3 bars. Okay, so that's good. So let me just kind of compare them here. So they're both in percents. Now let's look at the percentages. So the first category here, if I leave my mouse over top of it, it'll show me, is 39.4%. And if I go over here and leave my, you see I get 37.99. That's the difference that's coming on because we've got these not availables being excluded. If I want to know how many people that is, remember I could go back and change this to counts. And I know that This is 10 restaurants didn't provide information on the ownership type. So these percentages are divided by 269. These percentages are the counts divided by 279, and that's why the percentages are different. Okay, there's different reasons for presenting them. Most of the time when we get to inferential statistics, we're going to want to exclude the data. So if we're going to exclude the data, we still need to edit our graphs pretty correctly here, so I'm going to put a better title on this. So ownership type for n equal 279 restaurants okay. I'm going to fix this to say ownership type. I can double click on this again to get those labels like we had before. So the first one's a sole proprietor, the next one's a partnership, the third one's corporate. Okay, so you get those. Maybe you decide you want that to be a capital P, so you come back in here and you try that again. Now, it does say 279 in my title, which is permissible here, but I would probably add a footnote, and so that's what I'm going to do, add a footnote that says 10 restaurants did not provide information. And then percent within all data is correct. And so now I have a graph that shows it without the missing data. Okay, if I decided that, once again, I wanted this in counts, I could come over here, go to graph options, and I could change it back and forth if I wanted. So now it's in counts. If I go back up, I can put it back in percents. Okay, if I decide I really wanted it vertical and not horizontal, I can come up and I can go back to edit the X scale and say take the transpose off. If I had it this way originally and I wanted it, I could once again edit the X scale and put the transpose back on. Okay, so either way, once again, I can send the graph to Word and it'll be there in my Word document. Okay. So that's how we do the bar charts, as simple as you can, with a set of data. Okay. Now suppose we don't have any data. I take that back. Suppose we don't have a data set, but we have information. And so I'm going to come back to our restaurant data set window here, and I'm going to actually close it out. And I'm going to say, suppose instead I only have a problem that tells me the type of ownership. So maybe I have ownership type, that I can create a table in Minitab so that I can help to create a graph. So maybe my ownership type is sole proprietor, and then I know that I have some partnerships, and I know that I have some corporate, and maybe I have missing data if I really wanted it to show up. If I don't want the missing data to show up, I don't need to list it. And then I can talk about how many there are of each of these. So maybe there's 112 sole proprietors, there's 77 partnerships, and maybe there's 52 corporate. So suppose this is just the text that you find in your data set. Okay? You can certainly type up this information, list all the different classes, the groups, and then the counts. Quite honestly, it's putting a frequency table, right, inside this worksheet, inside a blank worksheet. So now that I have the frequency table, I can come up and once again do my graphs. I can come to graph, I can go to bar chart, but now I don't have the unique values, I have values from a table. I have a one column of values, right? There's only one column of values. Later, we'll get to the 2 columns. But right now, all I have is 1 column of data, so I'm doing it very simple. And I'll say OK. It says, what's your graph variable? Here it's looking for the variable that, or the column that has all your numbers in it. And so notice it didn't even give me ownership type because that's a text field, and a text field can't have numbers in it. So we're going to put count there. It's asking you what's your kind of your labels, your groups. And so if you typed them out nicely, notice you're not going to have to worry about labels later. If you put 1, 2, and 3 in, you'll have to change them later. So you can put ownership type in. Notice you have all the other options that you still have available here. And we can say OK. And there you go. Notice that it took the title of the column and it took the titles in each of those columns in order to do that. You'd still put a better title on this, right? So this is ownership type I don't know how many since I made this up. You could change this from counts to percentages if you wanted. Going to graph options. I'll leave it alone for now. Okay. And you've got your graph. So I'm going to send this graph to Word as well. And so you see that we can create graphs in Minitab, or at least bar graphs in Minitab, from either an actual data set where you have every single observation in the sample, or when there's enough detail given in the problem that you can create a frequency table. We can create the graph in Minitab. Okay, so that's how to create graphs and well-labeled graphs using Minitab.